The winter of 1947 came to San Giovanni Rotondo with unusual severity. Snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the monastery into an island of silence suspended between earth and sky. In the small infirmary, a young man lay dying. His name was Giuseppe, barely 23 years old, a soldier who had survived the war only to be consumed by an infection that no medicine could cure. Padre Pio sat beside the young man's bed, rosary beads moving slowly through his wounded fingers. Blood from his stigmata left small crimson marks on the wooden beads, each drop a prayer made visible. Giuseppe's breathing had become shallow, irregular, the sound of a soul preparing for departure. His mother knelt on the other side of the bed, her face a mask of helpless anguish, watching her son slip away moment by moment. "Padre," she whispered, her voice breaking, "can you see it? Can you see what awaits him?" Pio lifted his eyes from the rosary and looked at the dying young man. But what he saw made him close his eyes immediately, his breath catching in his throat. Around Giuseppe's bed, invisible to all others, a darkness had gathered. It was not the absence of light, but something with presence, with weight, with intention. It moved like smoke, like shadow given substance, coiling and uncoiling as though breathing. The shadow of death had entered the room. Pio had encountered this presence before, many times over his long years of ministry. He had learned to recognize it, not as an enemy, though it appeared fearsome, but as a servant, a reaper whose work was necessary in the divine economy. Death was not cruel by nature, but it was inexorable, and in its presence, all pretense fell away. The soul stood naked before eternity. As Pio watched, the shadow began to take form. It grew denser, darker, until it resembled a figure, tall, impossibly tall, draped in what appeared to be tattered vestments that moved with no wind. Where a face should be, there was only deeper darkness, an abyss that seemed to draw in all light. In its hands, if they could be called hands, it held something that gleamed dully, a cord, or perhaps a chain, waiting. Giuseppe stirred, his eyes opening but unfocused, seeing something beyond the room. "Freddo," he murmured. "So cold." The mother clutched her son's hand tighter, but Pio knew the cold Giuseppe felt came not from winter, but from the boundary he was approaching. The veil between worlds had grown thin around this bed, and the temperature of eternity was seeping through. "Do not be afraid," Pio said softly, though he spoke not only to Giuseppe but to the presence in the room. "We are all in God's hands." The shadow turned. Pio felt rather than saw this movement, and regarded him. For a long moment, Padre and death stood in silent communion. Then, to Pio's surprise, the shadow stepped back, creating space around the bed. An invitation, or perhaps a challenge. "See what I see, witness what I must do." Pio placed his wounded hand on Giuseppe's forehead, and the world shifted. Suddenly, he was no longer in the infirmary. He stood in a vast, empty plain, colorless and boundless, stretching in all directions toward horizons that never arrived. The ground beneath his feet was neither solid nor liquid, but something between, yielding yet supporting, like walking on the surface of a still, dark lake. The sky above was gray, featureless, without sun or stars. This was the threshold, the liminal space where souls paused before crossing fully into whatever awaited them. Giuseppe stood a few paces away, but he was changed. His body showed no signs of illness. He appeared whole, young, vibrant. Yet his face carried a look of profound confusion, of a man suddenly awakened from a dream. The young man's face twisted with sudden fear. "But I'm not ready. There are things I haven't done, things I haven't said. My mother, I never told her about the war, about what I did, what I saw. I carry things, Padre, dark things that I know," Pio interrupted. "Death has a way of bringing truth to the surface. Nothing can be hidden here." As if summoned by these words, the shadow appeared again, now more terrible in this threshold place than it had been in the physical world. It towered over them both, a monument of darkness, its presence creating a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult. The chain in its hands rattled with a sound like distant thunder. Giuseppe stumbled backward. "What is that? Padre, what is that thing?" "That is death," Pio said calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "The angel, if we can call it such, whose duty is to separate soul from body, to guide the departed across the final threshold. It is ancient, older than human memory, and it serves the one who made all things. The shadow moved closer to Giuseppe, and the young man fell to his knees, overwhelmed by its proximity. From within the darkness of its form, images began to emerge, not shown to Pio, but somehow made visible, projected into the gray air like paintings made of smoke. Pio saw Giuseppe's life unfold in reverse. He saw the battlefield, mud and blood, and the faces of dying men. He saw Giuseppe, younger still, pulling the trigger of his rifle, watching through his scope as distant figures fell. He saw a specific moment. A farmhouse, a door kicked open, civilians huddled in terror, and Giuseppe's finger tightening on the trigger before his sergeant shouted, stopping him at the last moment. The young man had not killed innocents, but he had been about to, had wanted to in his fear and rage and confusion. Giuseppe wept, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his being. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "God forgive me, I'm so sorry." Pio stepped forward, placing himself between the shadow and the weeping young man. "He repents," the priest said firmly. "You see his sorrow. You see his contrition." "I see," the shadow repeated. "But repentance does not erase what was done. The chain must be measured. The weight must be assessed." The chain in Death's hands began to glow with a dull, reddish light. It extended toward Giuseppe, segments appearing and disappearing, each link representing something. Sins committed, graces refused, moments of hardness when softness was needed. The chain grew longer, heavier, and Giuseppe's sobs intensified as he felt its weight pressing down on him. But then, Pio did something unexpected. He reached out with his stigmatized hands and grasped the chain. Pain shot through him instantly, worse than any suffering he had known. The chain burned like molten metal, froze like ice from the deepest winter, cut like razor wire into his already wounded palms. He cried out, but he did not let go. Blood poured from his hands, falling onto the gray ground and creating small pools of startling crimson. "What are you doing?" the shadow demanded, its voice rising to a roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of this threshold place. "I am a priest," Pio gasped through the agony. "I stand between God and humanity. This is my vocation, my calling. If this soul must carry chains, then I will help him bear the weight. If blood must be spilled for his redemption, then let it be mine. I offer my suffering for his sake." The shadow seemed to recoil, confused by this action. Death understood separation, understood endings, but this willingness to share in another's burden, was something it struggled to comprehend. Giuseppe looked up through his tears, seeing what Pio was doing. "No," he whispered. "Padre, no, you can't." "I can," Pio said, his voice steady despite the pain. "And I will. Because this is what love does. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Your mother's love kept you alive this long, Giuseppe. Let my love help you cross this threshold." The chain began to change. Where Pio's blood touched it, the links transformed, becoming lighter, brighter, until they no longer resembled iron but something closer to gold, or perhaps pure light. The weight that had pressed Giuseppe into the ground began to lift, and the young man found he could breathe again, could stand. The shadow watched this transformation with something that might have been wonder. "This is irregular," it said, its voice softer now, almost uncertain. "The laws of death and judgment are ancient, fixed. And yet love is older still," Pio said. "Love existed before death entered the world. Love will exist when death itself is finally defeated. You are powerful, shadow, but you are not ultimate." For a long moment, nothing moved in that gray, timeless space. Then, slowly, the shadow bowed, a gesture of acknowledgement, of respect, perhaps even of something like gratitude. The chain in its hands dissolved completely, becoming particles of light that drifted upward and vanished. "The weight has been lifted," Death said. "The debt has been paid by another. This soul is free to cross." Giuseppe stood fully now, his face transformed. The fear had not entirely left, but it was now mixed with something else. Hope, wonder, a tentative joy. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Pio said, releasing his grip on the now vanished chain and cradling his bleeding hands. "You must choose. The threshold has two directions. You can return to your body, live a while longer in the world of flesh. Or you can cross over, enter fully into eternity. Death has released its claim, but you must decide your path. The young man looked back the way they had come, though there was nothing visible to mark the direction. If I go back, he said slowly, will I remember this? Will I remember what you did for me? Perhaps, Pio said, or perhaps it will fade like a dream. But you will carry something deeper than memory. You will carry freedom. The chains of guilt will no longer bind you. You will be able to tell your mother you love her. You will be able to pray without that wall between you and God. You will be able to live what remains of your life without the weight that was crushing you. Giuseppe was silent for a long time. Then he turned and looked in the other direction, toward the deeper gray that represented the full crossing into death. And if I go forward, what waits there? I cannot tell you everything, Pio admitted. I have been granted glimpses, but the full reality is beyond my ability to describe. I can tell you this, you will not cross alone. And what awaits is not darkness, but light. Light so bright it would blind mortal eyes. Light that purifies and transforms and reveals the truth of all things. Will it hurt? Pio considered the question carefully. Perhaps. Purgation often does. But it is the pain of healing, not of harm. Like a wound being cleaned or a broken bone being set. The pain serves a purpose, and on the other side of it is wholeness. Giuseppe nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked at the shadow of death, no longer cowering but meeting its dark gaze directly. I'm ready, he said. Take me across. The shadow extended what might have been a hand, and Giuseppe took it without hesitation. As their contact was made, the young man's form began to grow luminous, as though lit from within. The gray world around them started to brighten, colors seeping in at the edges, gold, silver, shades of blue and green that Pio had never seen in earthly reality. Thank you, Padre, Giuseppe said, his voice already sounding distant, as though he were speaking from across a great expanse. Tell my mother I love her. Tell her I'm at peace. I will, Pio promised, tears streaming down his face. Go with God, my son. Go with God. Giuseppe and the shadow walked forward together, moving into the brightening distance. With each step, the young man became more translucent, more light than substance, until finally, he vanished completely, absorbed into the radiance that now flooded the threshold space. Pio stood alone in the emptying gray, his hands still bleeding, his body exhausted. But before he could return to his own flesh, a voice spoke, not the shadow's voice, but something infinitely greater, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Well done, faithful servant, the voice said, and Pio fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the presence of the divine. You have shown what it means to lay down one's life for another. You have demonstrated the love that defeats death. Because of this, I grant you a gift. You will continue to see the shadow, to stand at the threshold with those who cross. You will be a bridge between worlds, a comfort to the dying, a witness to my mercy. It is too much, Pio whispered. I am not worthy. None are worthy, the voice replied, and there was infinite tenderness in it. But you are willing, and that is enough. Go now, return to your body. There is still work for you to do. The gray world dissolved, and Pio felt himself rushing backward, pulled by an invisible force. The threshold vanished, the brightening light faded, and with a gasp, he opened his eyes in the infirmary. Giuseppe's body lay still on the bed, no longer breathing. But his face was peaceful, a slight smile on his lips, all the tension and pain erased. His mother wept, but when she looked at her son's peaceful expression, her tears became mixed with something like relief. He's gone, she said. My boy is gone. Yes, Pio said softly, rising from his chair with difficulty, his hands still bleeding freely. But he did not go alone, and he did not go into darkness. He crossed over into light, into peace. He wanted me to tell you that he loves you, and that he is at peace. The mother looked at Pio with wonder and gratitude, seeing the blood on his hands, the exhaustion in his face, knowing somehow that this priest had walked with her son through the valley of the shadow of death, and returned to tell her all was well. In the days that followed, word spread throughout the monastery and beyond. Padre Pio had been seen with the dying, and those who died in his presence seemed to cross over with unusual peace, their faces transfigured in their final moments. People began to request his presence at deathbeds, believing that he had some special power to ease the passage from life to death. But Pio knew it was not power he possessed. It was simply willingness to see what others could not see, to stand where others feared to stand, to bear witness to the great mystery of death and what lay beyond. The shadow became his strange companion, appearing whenever a soul prepared to cross. Sometimes it came gently, like a shepherd guiding sheep. Other times it came with terrible authority, breaking the bonds of flesh with force. But always, Pio was there, offering his prayers, his presence, his wounded hands as a sign that suffering was not the end of the story. One night, months after Giuseppe's death, Pio knelt in the chapel long after the other brothers had retired. He was praying for the dying throughout the world, all those who would cross that night without anyone to hold their hand or offer comfort. The shadow appeared beside him, silent as always, waiting. Why? Pio asked, the question he had never dared speak aloud until this moment. Why did God make death? Why must there be this separation, this ending? The shadow was quiet for a long time. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a weight of sorrow that Pio had not heard before. Death was not part of the original design, it said. I was not created to separate, but to transform. In the beginning, the passage from earthly life to eternal life was meant to be seamless, a gentle transition like waking from sleep. But sin entered the world, and with sin came true death, separation from God, from life, from all that is good. I became what you see now, a figure of endings and shadows. But even in this form, I serve a purpose. I break the bonds that would keep souls trapped in suffering. I open the door that leads beyond this broken world. I am not the enemy. I am the mercy that says, enough. Come home. Pio wept at these words, understanding flooding through him. Death was not God's cruelty, but God's kindness, a way of ensuring that no one would suffer forever, that every story would reach its conclusion and its transformation. Thank you, Pio whispered. Thank you for showing me. The shadow placed what might have been a hand on Pio's shoulder, a touch that was cold but not unkind. We will meet many times before your own crossing, it said. And when that day comes, I will be gentle with you, for you have been a friend to me and to those I guide. You have helped them see that I am not to be feared but welcomed, for I lead them home. Years later, when Padre Pio himself lay dying, surrounded by his brothers and those who loved him, the shadow came one final time. But now it appeared different, less dark, more luminous, as though the years of Pio's companionship had transformed it. Or perhaps Pio's eyes had simply learned to see more truly. I'm ready, Pio said, his voice weak but peaceful. I've been ready for a long time. The shadow took his hand, and as it did, Pio saw beyond the form to what it truly was. Not a monster, not an enemy, but an angel after all, simply wearing the face that mortality required it to wear. Behind that face was beauty, sorrow, and an ancient dedication to serving the one who made all things. Come, the angel said. Giuseppe is waiting, and so many others you helped across. They've been preparing a welcome for you. Padre Pio smiled, closed his eyes, and let go. The threshold opened before him, but this time it was not gray. It was filled with light, with color, with the faces of all those he had helped, all those he had loved, all those who had gone before him into the eternal day. And standing among them, bridging earth and heaven, was the figure he had once called the shadow, now revealed in its true form, a servant of God, an angel of mercy, a guide to the eternal home. The last thing Pio heard in the earthly world was the sound of singing, as though heaven itself had opened its gates and was welcoming him in with joy. And the last thing he felt was not pain, not fear, but overwhelming peace, and the certainty that death was not an ending but a beginning, not a separation but a reuniting, not a shadow but a doorway into light.